And now, we would like to welcome to the stage Dylan Matthews from Vox. Please also welcome our expert panelists, Kamolika Das, Vanessa Williamson, and Chye-Ching Huang.
Excited to have a in-depth and deeply wonky conversation about where taxes are going. So we had a kind of interesting first couple years under Biden where it seemed like some pretty major changes were going to happen to the tax code. And I think it's fair to say that the changes in the Inflation Reduction Act were significant, but not quite what people were demanding. Maybe we can start with you, Kamolika. How would you describe where the tax code is after the IRA, particularly as relates to sort of progressivity and achieving a sort of a tax code that fights inequality?
Hello, is this on?
I think it is.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. I will say that I definitely know more about state and local policy. But I would just say that there is just so much more work to be done. You know, I think that Dorothy Brown just brought this up, but the fact that, you know, we do basically still tax capital at lower rates than income. I mean, that's a huge problem. If you think about, I mean, sure, it's like the federal tax system is marginally progressive, but if you think about all of the deductions that are still there, those are all, you know, very, very regressive. If you just think about, you know, the tax, like where are most tax incentives going, most tax abatements, you know, preferring homeowners to renters. There are just so many different things that we could be doing. And so, I mean, obviously we're making progress, but still there's a lot of work to do.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that's important to compare against is not just sort of where we want to go, but where sort of the public wants to go. Vanessa, I'm going to pick on you here. You've done some research on how Americans think about taxes, where they want it to go in terms of structure and progressivity. What have your big takeaways been there? What's the tax code that people want?
Well, I think that if you're interested in creating a more progressive tax code, the barrier to achieving that is not the American people. This is not a problem with hearts and minds. So first of all, I'll just say that Americans see taxpaying as a civic duty. They think it's very important, and they're very angry that wealthy people aren't paying their share, right? So if you ask people, is you know, paying your taxes a civic duty, you get something like between 90 and 95% of Americans saying yes. I at one point looked for other survey questions that had that level of consensus, and you have to ask about things like whether the moon landing happened or whether Elvis is alive. Like, Americans agree on this point, that you should be paying your taxes. And if you ask people what they're mad about with the tax system, right? A lot of people are angry about the tax system. Well, what are they angry about? The top two answers consistently for literally decades has been that corporations and the wealthy are not paying their share. That's what bothers people most. It is not the amount that they personally pay. Again and again, they choose progressivity as their issue of primary importance when they're thinking about the tax code. And you can see this across all kinds of things. No matter how many different plans you put out there to tax wealth, all of them poll well, right? Everyone always likes them when they come out. So when we're thinking about what stands between us and the tax code that we want, the issue is really not in the thoughts or the political preferences of the American people. But as we all know, politics and policy are not a poll, right? Policy outcomes are not matched with public opinion. If they were, our gun laws would look very different, our minimum wage would look really different, our healthcare system would look really different, and our tax code would look really different. So so I guess there's a very positive story here, right? Which is that the kind of work that I think everyone in this room wants to do is the kind of work that Americans want done. But there's also a very depressing story, which is that Americans have wanted that done for literally decades, right? And it hasn't happened. So we need to think seriously about what the actual barriers are, like the actual political barriers are to what we want to achieve.
That's a great point, and something I'd love you or maybe Chye-Ching to pitch in on. 2022 was just a year of a million plans for taxing the wealthy and corporations. There was the billionaires tax proposal from Ron Wyden. There was an effort to close the angel of death loophole, which is my favorite thing to complain about in the federal tax code. if you'll forgive me a brief indulgence. If Mark Zuckerberg dies before selling his Facebook stock, all the money he gained before he died is not taxable under current law. And there was an effort to change that because it's insane and makes no sense. But Heidi Heitkamp and some other sort of former senators successfully lobbied against that, and it didn't make it in. So maybe Chye-Ching first, and then I'm interested for other thoughts. Sort of what happened? Why did those fail, and what can we learn from the sort of fight to get those into the IRA for future tax policy discussions?
Yeah, I would love to also spend some time complaining about that loophole, and I am going to get there. Like that's going to be my dessert. But I do want to just sort of like stand back a little bit. I think because there were so many big ideas in circulation across those 2 years, we forget how big an achievement that is from a lot of people in this room to have put those ideas on the table so that they were really seriously in contention. So that's one thing that we need to celebrate and take forward. The second thing is it's also easy, because we had so much that we were wanting to achieve, to forget that we actually did achieve some really structurally important things that we need to also celebrate and defend. So the money for the IRS, if it is implemented well, with all of the caveats and all of the people like Dorothy Brown and the folks in this room pushing that it be implemented in the right way, that is a huge opportunity to make people who are currently not following the law, not paying the taxes that they owe, and primarily at the top of the income distribution and well-resourced, actually have to follow the law. And that is a really big deal in a system that's been eroded for a decade. It's a really big deal that the IRS now has the resources that it can pilot a public option for filing your taxes online free. And it's not a coincidence, and this is a phrase that I've heard Vanessa use previously, that we're now getting lots of scaremongering about 87,000 IRS agents with guns and all sorts of other things happening at that same time. We need to push back against that and celebrate those wins and defend them. The other thing we need to celebrate is that people kind of forget there's a couple of $100 billion of tax increases on corporations in that law. So we have a platform to take forward. We have a lot that we need to do, and let me know when it's time to go back to complaining about the angel of death loophole. but I do want to just sort of start, and maybe we can also end with a little bit of optimism on this front.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important point. I jumped straight to the negative, but let's dwell on the positive a little bit. Kamolika, maybe we could bring you in here. One thing that's happened is that there was a lot of aid for state and local governments from the American Rescue Plan, and that's led to a lot of changes, good and bad, but I think primarily good at the state level in their tax codes. Could you walk us through what's happened there and what that's meant?
Yeah, I think that it's really incredible to see that, you know, if you think about some of the federal changes, like the child tax credit and what some states have been doing with that, you know, there have been at least, in this legislative session alone, there have been at least 7 states that have either enacted or enhanced their state earned income tax credits. There have been at least 6 that have either enhanced or created child tax credits. I mean, Minnesota is incredible. You know, having a child tax credit that is, you know, supposed to be cutting childhood poverty by about 1/3. And there's a lot that is really exciting. And I think that, sorry, I'm going to go back to that question that you asked Vanessa for a second, just on the state front, about, well, we know that majority of people are looking for progressive taxes. Most people agree on higher taxes for the wealthy and corporations. The problem is often when legislators or wealthy interests, they intervene, you know, sometimes through fear mongering, but also sometimes genuinely through undermining democracy. Like Arizona in 2020 passed a wealth tax increase for the wealthy to fund education, and very shortly afterwards, the legislators went and then introduced at least 100 restrictive voting bills. Yeah, they introduced at least 100. And so, there's this huge gulf between what voters actually want and then what legislators are doing. And I think that, you can't talk about tax policy without talking about voting rights. Sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent, but
No,
I just wanted to
voting
bring
rights
that
are
in.
never a tangent. We want this to be the right room, and that's super important. And I think something worth underlining on state and local, just if I can pick on you a little bit more, is just how much more regressive the baseline is there. And this is something you guys at ITEP do a lot of data on, but when you compare sort of people's federal taxes to state taxes, why are state taxes hitting low-income and middle-income people so much harder than the federal code?
Yeah, if you look at where a lot of the state tax revenue is coming from, a lot of that's coming from, sales taxes and like excise taxes. And I think the unfortunate thing is that there's often this vicious cycle where you have like a wealthy elite, and they already have this disproportionate hold on levers of power, so they're much more successful in, lobbying for regressive tax cuts. And so when I talk about the great progress we've made or states have made on refundable tax credits, I really do not want to ignore that there are a lot of states out there that have been passing really harmful, deep income tax cuts. And it's just been getting more and more insidious. You have places like Oklahoma and Nebraska where they're doing it in this really phased in way with these triggered tax cuts. And so, most of the legislators, they're getting these political points for introducing them and for passing them, and they're not even gonna be in office maybe when the actual real impacts of that are gonna be seen. And so, I just think that, like, in terms of why it's happening, is that vicious cycle is sometimes embedded into state policy structures already. If you think about all the states that have supermajority requirements, and so it's really easy to cut taxes and really difficult to raise them. I mean, you see in a lot of state constitutions, they have property tax limits. And so, if states can't rely on enough property tax revenue, then they're shifting to sales taxes or really regressive fines and fees. So there's just a lot that's structural, and that just comes, Vanessa can tell you way more about this, about the history of that. But, I think that just where that state money is coming from and how much we can raise, and there are limitations on states, and then there are also limitations, a lot of state preemption of local governments too. So a lot of local governments, they're also relying heavily on fines and fees as well. So,
and that, of course, has a very heavily racialized dimension in terms of who those fines and fees hit, as Dorothy reminds us. Vanessa, let's talk a bit about that history. That I think there was a moment in the 2010s where it seemed like we were ending the tax revolt era, or maybe I was too optimistic about this, but 1978, California passes Prop 13, massive tax backlashes, especially at the state level. And then suddenly you had Jerry Brown trying to pass large-scale tax increases through the ballot. Recently, there was even an attempt to roll back part of Prop 13. Where are we on that? Has the pendulum fully shifted, or are we still kind of living in the Prop 13 world, albeit in altered form?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first I'll take it back a little further and talk about where our supermajoritarian requirements at a state level come from, right? Many of you probably know this history already, but the origin of supermajority requirements, which is a way of saying rule by the minority, right? Those measures appeared first in the American South, and they appeared first in the American South in the period after the fall of Reconstruction, the brief experiment with multiracial democracy after the Civil War, when white supremacists overthrew those governments and reinstalled the governments that became known as the sort of Jim Crow era governments. One of the things they did consistently was make it impossible for a simple majority to raise taxes. And this was part of a much larger campaign to shift taxes onto the poor and onto black people, and to protect white wealth, right? And by the way, when we're talking about why it's important to tax labor and wealth equally, one of the reasons is because white people have been allowed to accumulate wealth for generations, right? So this is those measures specifically to protect wealth stem from the worst defeat of racial justice in our history. That is when states start having these supermajority requirements. And then you see a sudden rush of other ones in the late 70s and early 80s, the sort of dawn of the Reagan Revolution, part of the backlash to the second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement. So, again, exactly as Dorothy Brown suggested, we cannot distinguish these issues of racial justice and tax justice. So where are we today? One thing that has shown sort of a steady increase in effectiveness is tax ballot measures to raise taxes. Voters are increasingly willing, to vote for a tax increase. Now, it's not easy. Ballot measures in general are hard to win. Tax ballot measures may well be harder than other ballot measures to win. But it has happened. It's happened in a number of states. It happened in Massachusetts, another state that had one of the big property tax caps of the sort of Reagan era. So I think there is real progress there. But exactly, kind of just as you said, every time we find a road forward towards tax progressivity, we find backlash against democracy, right? And so that's what you see in Arizona. So I think that on the one hand, I think we're in a much better place because I think the stakes are clearer. I think more people recognize that marginal tax rates are not some minor concern merely for accountants, but are actually at the core of the democratic project, right? And that's small d democratic project. I think more people see that now, and more people recognize that because taxes are public power, because taxes are what fund the state, because taxes are what pay for the social programs that create freedom for the market, because taxes have these incredibly powerful effects. Wealthy people have consistently organized to undermine democracy when they face higher tax rates, right? So I think we know the problem more clearly now. We can articulate it more clearly, and that is in its own way a victory, but that does not mean that we have won.
Yeah. And yeah, there was a lot there. I'm just sort of trying to take it all in. No, I mean that in the best possible way. But I think one aspect of the Reagan Revolution I've been thinking a lot about. I was reading a book that some of my co-panelists have probably encountered called "Starving the Beast" by Monica Prasad, which is talking about the Reagan Revolution in the 80s. And one of the arguments she makes that I think is powerful is that we have a big debate about taxes nationally, and it's between a party that wants to raise taxes on rich people and corporations and one that wants to reduce them further. And there isn't really a constituency for like across the board tax increases. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we care about progressivity, but so much of state capacity comes from our ability to tax, from an ability to sort of raise revenue. And I think part of the argument there is that since Reagan, we've had a consensus that you just can't raise taxes on people making less than, I think the number is now $400,000 a year that Biden has said. Maybe we can start with Chye-Ching, but I'm curious for all of your thoughts. Sort of what is that consensus meant? How has that sort of affected state capacity and what we can use taxes to do?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Vanessa put it in much bigger context, but I think for the sort of the nearer term and setting up for 2025, when a bunch of this is going to be on the table, and that fight is. Well, it started a few hours ago when the House Ways and Means Committee started to introduce bills to make parts of the 2017 tax law that was enacted under President Trump permanent, as part of like one of the initial sort of shots in that battle. But there is a lot that we can do at the very top, including taxing some of this huge accumulation of income and wealth that is not ever subject to tax. So it's a matter of priorities. I think ultimately, eventually, we might want to, for the purposes of capacity and funding public goods and all of these other things, think about a broader swath of tax measures. But if I would have to choose one thing to sort of move forward on, it would be plugging some of the holes where some of the income of the very wealthiest people and largest businesses in the nation is currently invisible to the tax system. So I think we've got a lot to work on in the meanwhile, but I think you're right that this is a sort of a longer term question that's facing a lot of large economies.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on that as well. So this is something that, again, many people probably heard, but I think it's fun to remember. The Trump tax cut was not popular. Like, let's just celebrate that for a moment. There's a victory in and of itself, right? Like, people didn't like that. There's some other good news kind of in the same vein, which is that...
and unprecedented, right? Like, we have never had a couple of $1 trillion of tax cuts be underwater with every voting segment.
Yeah.
Independents, Republicans, Democrats. that is, I think, a victory of sort of facts over, like, the talking point of tax cuts is going to be good for everyone and trickle down. People understood what it meant in terms of trade-offs for the budget, inequality, all of the things that you work to sort of push out there. So, but
Yeah,
sorry,
no,
like,
I mean,
yeah,
this is
plus
exactly
one.
right. Yeah. No, this is exactly right. So, I mean, the Democrats, overwhelmingly rich and poor Democrats, love tax increases on the rich. It's absolutely a unifying issue for the Democratic Party. It divides Republicans, and that's part of why you could get a tax cut to be underwater, right? Because there are quite a lot of people who are Republicans. There's a huge class divide among Republicans on a bunch of issues. The minimum wage is one of them. Taxing the rich is another. So not only is it the case that taxing the rich is more popular with low-income Republicans, obviously, than high-income Republicans, and there's a huge divide on that. But if you tell low-income Republicans who pays a tax, it becomes more popular when it affects the rich. So, for example, you may remember the estate tax, at one point labeled the death tax, right? So a very carefully done study was conducted where all they did was inform people that the estate tax was paid by the top at the time. I think it was 2% of households. And what you find is that low-income Republicans who had been opposed to the estate tax on the same level as high-income Republicans, when they find out who pays it, suddenly it's literally popular. A majority support the estate tax, which the Republican Party has dedicated an enormous amount of time to demonizing. So I think, Chye-Ching's exactly right. One of the things, this is another place where we can celebrate meaningful change in how people are thinking about these issues. And a lot of that has to do with the work that's done by people in this room.
Can I jump in on that too?
Please do.
That's a good question.
Ungovernable panel. We're just going to get totally out of control and make you regret ever agreeing to this.
Yeah, I just want to say, yes, definitely there has been a lot of money and resources poured into, creating this sort of self-perpetuating anti-tax narrative that when the economy's good, oh, we can afford to cut taxes. And when the economy's bad, oh, well, now we have to cut taxes. But I do think that if you look at specific examples, we are starting to see pushback on this. I just don't want to lose some of these examples. Like in Massachusetts last November, people voted for a tax on the wealthy, and that's going to fund about $2 billion for education and transportation funding. Yeah, and this was at a time there was a revenue surplus. They were not talking about messaging, there was no desperate plea for funding. This was completely about equity. Before this amendment passed, the top 1%, they were spending less as a share of income than everybody else. And then after this amendment passed, that pretty much evened out. In Washington state, they've passed a capital gains tax, which their state Supreme Court just upheld. And so Washington state has the single most regressive tax system in the nation. So that is huge progress for a place like Washington. And, Minnesota, huge wins on the refundable tax credits, but then also what, folks maybe didn't make the news as much was they almost passed this absolutely game-changing policy on worldwide combined reporting that would have completely cracked down on national corporations shifting their profits to offshore tax havens. And that was introduced in the House and the Senate, and that would have been incredible. But what happened was that a lot of businesses and tax preparers that helped those businesses find loopholes, they completely panicked and they killed the bill. But Minnesota was still able to pass a different a different policy that helped crack down on some of this shifting profits. And I think just the fact that it got as far as it did, I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of other states that introduce similar legislation next year. And this is just going to, there's just going to be a lot of momentum.
Yeah, the Minnesota DFL right now is on a crazy streak. Very impressive stuff. Chye-Ching, I wanted to pick up on Kamolika's point about multinational taxation. One thing that did make it into the IRA was a minimum book tax, and I'm a reporter who writes about taxes, and even I sometimes struggle to understand what's distinctive about that versus the guilty versus various things. Where do we stand on that, and what are your priorities going forward for making the corporate tax system fairer?
Yeah, I think, it's easy. It's easy and sometimes enjoyable for the wonky wonks amongst us to sort of like get really stuck in the details of these things. And I would always enjoy having a fun time discussing what would be the very best way to raise a couple of $100 billion on large corporations. The one that was enacted was probably not my favorite. It is pretty complex, as you were saying, but the big takeaway is a couple of $100 billion from the largest corporations. And we know from research and from a lot of the work that people in this room have done, spreading that research out, that a lot of corporate profit is not, in fact, profit that comes from innovation and new investment. It is profit from rent seeking, existing market entrenchment, profit shifting, and taking advantage of the holes in tax systems worldwide and in states. So that is a pretty efficient, good way to raise revenue that ultimately is borne by the highest income people in the country that tend to be the ones that own assets like corporate stock. So it's a big step forward. You're sort of edging me back into things that I wish we'd done in the IRA, and I think is really, really structurally important for us to be thinking about coming up to this 2025 fight, which is to implement the US's side of this global deal that tax justice campaigners spent decades changing the narrative around and securing, that globally we have to stop corporations from being able to use tax avoidance to strip revenue from developing countries, developed countries, tax havens, and really not pay their fair share anywhere. There was a global deal that says we're going to stop this, we're going to put a minimum rate on big corporate profits, and we're going to stop this global race to the bottom to cut taxes and cut taxes and cut taxes on corporations. Huge achievement, huge administrative achievement, but now the US has to actually implement legislation that would secure that achievement, and that is, like, again, structurally important for decades to come. It could help us in very many countries shore up public provision of goods and services in a way that's really important. So, yeah.
I think going back at least to the League of Nations, the U.S. has been really good at negotiating multilateral deals that it then doesn't live up to. but getting something done on that seems really important. I wanted to ask you more about 2025, since I think that's an important year for people who know about tax. It's sort of this looming event on the horizon. What happens then? Why is that going to be such a fulcrum year for the tax code?
Yeah, so let me take you back into history, not quite as deep history as Vanessa's, but when the 2017 tax law was written, Republicans were doing it through this fast-track process called reconciliation, and they wanted to do tax cuts worth lots and lots and lots and put a label on it that was only worth 1.5 trillion. And the way that they did that was a really tried and true method, which is they set a bunch of things to expire, sunset, and they set some tax increases to ratchet up over time, and they explicitly told people that they would turn them off before they ever got to that point. So in 2025, the end of 2025 is when a bunch of these expirations hit. So we will be having a debate that will probably force legislators to take action on some $4 trillion over the next decade after that of tax changes that are set to come onto the table. So the stakes are really big in terms of revenue capacity, in terms of where those tax dollars come from and go to, and in terms of these really structural things that are on the table, the future of the corporate tax system across nations, whether the IRS has funding to continue to transform and improve service, and whether we can close that gaping hole in the tax system that is the ability of very high net worth people to accumulate income and never pay tax on it across generations. So it's a huge fight, and I hope you're all going to be joining us and watching along and engaging in it.
Yeah, Vanessa, how are you thinking about 2025? What do you think should be Progressive's the sort of main goals to get out of that deal and those negotiations?
I mean, to me, the main thing to think about is I'm a political scientist by training, so the dork phrase is that we have a lot of veto points in our political system. That is to say, we have a lot of points set up to stop action, right? These were very intentionally put in place by the founders, and I will restrain myself from talking about why. Yes, okay. The point being there are a lot of veto points. There are a lot of veto points, which means that the status quo has a huge advantage, right? Now, the status quo is often very bad, right? Because necessarily elites benefited from it, and oppressed people did not. But when things sunset, sometimes the status quo is on our side. And so that's, to me, is sort of the angle on the fight that I'm looking at, is to think about the ways in which things that are going to happen, if nothing happens, what good will come, and can we preserve those things, is part of the way I would think about the fight, just because the roadblocks to change in our federal system are so very high.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I believe is I don't know if this particular provision is sunsetting, but something from 2017 that's been really important for state and local governments is the SALT limitation. And it's an interesting thing in that it's a kind of progressive measure by income, that it limits a tax break for higher income people, but also interacts with state governments' abilities to fund themselves. I'm curious how you think about that, Kamolika, in your work. How has that affected the states that you study and work with?
I feel like Brandon McCoy should take this, just because he's been the one who has often, is he here? Gotten into a lot of fights. But yeah, I mean, I think that in general, we need to think about where that money is coming from. And like, if this is something I think that often those discussions, even in places that are so-called, are generally like progressive, like New Jersey, for example, it's somehow not progressive when it comes to SALT deductions, right? Like there's suddenly everybody cares about equity, but not when it comes to this. And so I just think that keeping equity on the forefront of everybody's mind, that needs to be the bigger goal.
Absolutely. So we've touched on this in various ways, but I did want to spend a section talking more concentratedly about what's happening with the IRS. So they have all this new money. Some of it got rescinded in this deal, but the bulk of it is still there. Vanessa, you've written a lot about how people interact with the tax system. How is this going to change that? How is this going to change people's relationship to their taxes?
Well, I think that so it's interesting if you talk to Americans about the IRS. It's not a particularly popular agency, though it remains more popular than Congress. That is a very, very low bar. And people simultaneously have this sort of, a phrase that comes up a lot in interviews is that they're like the men in black. They're like this sort of mysterious agency that's very powerful and scary, right? Which is a rhetoric that conservatives have tapped into for a long time, making the part of the state that has power over property seem like the scary part, as opposed to, say, the police part of the state being the scary part. So on the one hand, people have that image, but then people actually, of course, interact with the IRS. They call the IRS because they have questions. They, have experienced some kind of audit, and generally those experiences are banal and boring, which is the real thing that you want your tax agency to be. And so there's a really divided mental image that people have, and I think it's really important because there is this very strong narrative on the right of demonizing the IRS and more generally the tax capacity of the state, for progressives to be much more vocal than they have been in support of the IRS and the tax capacity of the state. The other thing I'll say, and I'm going to pass it over to Chye-Ching probably, because I know, I could feel over there how much you want to talk about the IRS. I just feel like buzzing with excitement. The other thing I'll say is that the opportunity that the IRS has to some degree now to do tax filing for people is, I think, plausibly a game changer, right? Because if I told you that the top two things people complain about the tax code are that corporations don't pay their share, the wealthy don't pay their share. The third thing people complain about is complexity. And what that means is that it's annoying to do your taxes, right? To do your federal and state income taxes is an irritating process. Although, weirdly, a third of people enjoy it. I love taxes, and I don't understand that. But anyway, but complexity is the third issue. And so to the extent we can, that complexity is really about the process, right? And I think that to the extent you can improve that experience for people, you will improve overall attitudes about taxation in a way that I would think might actually be unprecedented in the time that we've had the income tax. But
Yeah, it's been a deliberate thing, though. Like, I think that there is documentation of particular firms that have a particular interest in the way that things are set up now, being very direct with lawmakers that if you make tax filing easy for people, they won't vote for you to cut their taxes. So this has been a sort of a deliberate thing. I do want to, again, just sort of wind back just a few months before we were sort of hearing sort of scaremongering about IRS agents with semi-automatic weapons to a time when we were talking about a bipartisan infrastructure package. And Republicans were very nearly ready to sign on to $40 billion of new funding for the IRS, which is about half of what Democrats eventually enacted in the IRA. The thing that was reported that happened was that the liberal tax evasion lobby got to a few members. There was a company that had paid or was facing paying a few $1 billion in fines for tax evasion that really worked not getting funding to the agency that ensures that people comply with the tax laws. So again, Dylan started by asking sort of what happened in some of these things. And some of the time, we have time for the facts to get through in the way that Vanessa was talking about, and for public response to be such that lawmakers feel that they have to respond to that. Sometimes things move quickly enough, and it's harder to sort of break through about what's exactly happening. And as the media specialist on the panel, maybe we should ask Dylan about like how we can be doing better to sort of break through with those facts. But it is part of the question that is facing us going forward as we're now back into this mode of scaremongering about an agency.
Yeah, and as long as we're talking about media, I have to shout out the team at ProPublica, in particular, Justin Elliott, who's done incredible reporting on Intuit and H&R Block and the ways they try to block measures to make doing your taxes easier. Kamolika, I wanted to ask about what this means for states, since one of the main things that the federal income tax does is it's a basis for state income taxes. My adjusted gross income in DC is basically my adjusted gross income federally. How have you seen states reacting to this new money, and have you seen them responding and trying to adapt, or is that something they're falling behind on?
Sorry, did you mean about new money or free file? Or
free filing,
okay.
Specifically. So for if people aren't familiar with this, part of the new money is going to the IRS setting up a system where you don't have to go to TurboTax or an external service. You can just pay your taxes online.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be huge for states. I mean, if you think about, in my mind, one of the first, I mean, maybe this is like very specific, but one of the things that comes to mind is, you know, if states are able to rely more on free file, then just how much that would change for refundable tax credits. You know, right now, a lot of folks who get refundable tax credits, you know, even though there are often like VITA sites and, you know, they're not utilized as much, but if they could actually take home a bigger portion of their entire refundable tax credit, you know, what would happen? And I think that would actually make the refundable tax credit, those policies, far more effective. And then that would in turn expand support for them, expand demand. The higher the take up, there might be, you know, they might even become more generous. And so it just becomes this like domino, this like really positive domino effect.
So I think, speaking of refundable credits, I wanted to ask the panel, and I'm interested for all of your thoughts on this, on the experience of the 2021 child tax credit. So that was a really exciting year. I had been writing about these ideas to finally make this tax credit, which had a complicated phase and structure, universally available to all but the richest families. And we finally got it for a year. And I was really optimistic. And I thought, you know, if we just have this thing, people will benefit from it. It'll create a constituency. We'll keep going. And then just kind of fizzled. And there's sort of a simplistic version, which is Joe Manchin personally did not like it. But there's deeper structural things behind that, and there's also a deeper legacy at the state level, as Kamolika has pointed out. But maybe we can start with you, Vanessa. What do you make of the political story there? What can we learn about building support for measures to help low-income people from the child tax credit experience?
Yeah, I think that this is something that came up at some other panels today as well, is thinking about how we can take what we're seeing as emergency measures for crisis and make people recognize that a lot of Americans live in that crisis situation every day and shouldn't. And so I think that this is one of the sort of classic examples of it, that we allow the opportunity posed by a crisis to pass, right? Specifically on the refundable credits. And I think Dorothy Brown talked a little bit about this, but the transition of those credits to something that is racialized has undermined support for them in the same way, I think, that support for more traditional welfare programs, direct income support programs, suffered in some earlier generations. And I think that is, again, something that we need to confront head on. Right. I think that for a time in sort of the 90s and early 2000s, it was thought that the EITC would escape the stigma associated with welfare programs, both because you have to do work to receive it and because it was in the tax code and would therefore remain invisible. But I think that Republican support for the EITC was always weaker than people like to imagine in a lot of circumstances. But also, issues can become racialized, and this one did. And I think that it demonstrates to me that trying to sidestep racial injustice to find a policy solution is going to either fail immediately or set you up for failure in the future. So that's the lesson that I draw, that this is something that has to be confronted directly, and it's not something you can sidestep.
Chye-Ching, what did you learn from the C2C experience?
Yeah, I think there's been probably a little bit of overinterpretation of some of the results about what people felt about the child tax credit, because the way that it went out and the way that the surveys asking people about it were designed, it wasn't actually clear whether they were being asked about the piece that you could receive throughout the year or the increase. And we need to sort of split apart those two things, like just getting more money versus getting it regularly. So I think there's still some work to do to understand which of those two things are the most important for people. The other thing is, it was a crisis. And, we've all heard about how the crisis response stopped a huge increase in poverty and hardship than would otherwise have happened. But think about what that means for people. That meant for people that things, although it did for a lot of people, but overall, just in terms of their income levels, did not get worse. Overall, that's what they were seeing. And when you're trying to measure the popularity of a measure and you're asking people to imagine how much worse things would have been but for this money that came in, it can be a hard sort of mental game to play. So in some sense, we were, I think, in terms of the way that it was received and media and then lawmakers thought about it, we were sort of somewhat victims of the success of the moment of stopping people from experiencing much, much worse than they would have otherwise.
Kamolika, I would love to talk about some of the state successes. We talked about Minnesota, but I think one of the great legacies of that year is that there's been this flurry of action at the state level on child credits, and there had been action on EITC before, but I think some of the stuff on the child credit specifically is new. What have some of the highlights of that been?
So I would say New York. I mean, that's a really big one where they expanded. Before, it didn't actually reach your youngest children or lowest income workers. So I think being able to, changing those, some of the really negative parts of those, that's been huge. I would also say that I was talking to advocates in Mississippi about the child tax credit. That would have never happened a few years ago. So I don't know. I just think that the extent of the changes, I think I maybe already mentioned this, but yeah, I mean, I think in some places like expanding it to all immigrants, I mean, that's been huge, and that's like not something, again, that people had been talking about in the past. And I don't know, I think for me, like one of the takeaways is essentially like that progressive momentum. You know, it's not just like straightforward. I think that the way that we've seen it is, okay, so this happened on the federal front, and yeah, okay, so you know, couldn't get that extended. But now we see all this like huge flurry of movement in the states. And I would not be surprised if, you know, that pressure would then force action again on the federal front, right? So, I mean, I just don't necessarily think it's like this, like in one line. I feel like it kind of just like goes around in circles, and yeah, we'll see more movement.
Absolutely. We'd love to open this up for questions if anyone has questions for our distinguished panel. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for coming to talk to us. I think you guys had a wonderful conversation. I wrote a question down so I'd be prepared. So last year, Democrats tried to get a deal on the CTC in the omnibus bill by telling Republicans that they wouldn't pass the R&D tax credit without CTC. That same dynamic is playing out again this year, with Democrats again trying to pair an expansion of the CTC with restoring the R&D tax credit and likely other tax breaks for the wealthy, like bonus depreciation. When thinking about these types of trade-offs, what's the best way to sort of weigh the negative downstream effects of providing more tax breaks for the wealthy versus the positive effects of that we, all know the CTC has?
Chye-Ching, do you want to try that one?
Yeah, it always kind of depends, right? So I'm going to give a real lawyer/economist answer on that one. But I mean, I think it's a really hard set of questions when, like, one thing it depends on is, do you think that those businesses are going to get their tax breaks anyway, right? You've got to make a call on how likely it is lawmakers of all stripes are to be to sort of fall over themselves to make those sorts of things permanent, and you could get nothing at all for them if you don't sort of try. That's one sort of set of world circumstances to think about. Like, it depends on what. The other it depends on is what's happening on the other side of the budget, right? Are you in a situation like the Inflation Reduction Act where you've got a bunch of, you're going through reconciliation and the budget rules say you have to offset every single dollar within the budget window, or outside the budget window? Maybe if you've got in play very large corporate tax increases that are structurally important and let you sort of build towards increasing the corporate tax rate over time, and a global tax deal in which we're not on a corporate race to the bottom, maybe that's an okay offset in terms of paying for some of these other things, right? So it always depends on a lot of things, and personally, I find it really, really quite difficult, and this is why it is difficult in rooms like this and when people are lawmaking, to look at an opportunity to reduce hardship for low-income children and say, no, we're not going to do that because, these already very rich corporations are going to get a little bit more. Like, that is always a really hard position to be in, and we always want here to be sort of very connected with the communities that are being affected by these decisions when we are trying to make those sorts of decisions. And I think, often sort of talking to the people in the field and the households that are affected by these decisions, not just in the sort of hypothetical long run of the world, but next week, next year, it's important to keep hearing those voices. So I don't know the answer, but that's a process-based response.
I think we might have some remote questions. If no, we don't. All right. Any non-remote questions?
Hi. Great panel. I couldn't think of better people to be on the panel. My question is regarding IRS algorithmic bias. In that same Stanford paper that Dorothy Brown mentioned before, noting the audit discrepancies by race, they simulate various ways that the IRS targets people for audits, and every which way they cut it, racial disparities show. And I'm just wondering if the panel could shed light on how the IRS can effectively and equitably implement tax policy, especially with the funding being really imminent. Thanks.
Yeah, whoever wants to grab that.
All right, no, thanks for that question. Yeah, but I think, and this is to Dorothy's point, right? How do you produce that when you're not looking at like actual race on a tax return? Well, my hypothesis, and we don't know for sure because they haven't taken a good hard look yet, which is something that they say they're doing right now. But my hypothesis is what they are doing is that they are going off the outcomes of prior audits, right? So we know that based on prior audits, people with these, that take these deductions and with these characteristics based on their sort of the way that they fill in their tax return, not race, not zip code, they say they don't use zip code, but these sorts of people are more likely when we are audited to find that they have taxes to owe. Now, is that actually targeting people that are non-compliant with taxes? Or is it simply replicating the barriers that certain households and communities face to getting accurate, affordable help to file and understand their tax obligations? People that don't have good internet access, who don't have an in-person taxpayer assistance centre that is open in their area because IRS funding cuts mean that they've all been shut down, and if you have a hearing difficulty, that means phones are difficult. Maybe you're not going to be able to talk to a real person if you call the phone, all of those things. So are we just targeting towards auditing people for whom the barriers to participating in this system are already the highest? And that is like a key question that I think they should be answering as they look at both this audit process and their process of actually conducting audits. It's really critical that we don't just sort of replicate in this downstream enforcement the upfront barriers that people have to participating, and in fact, they should be using the money to reduce those barriers.
Yep.
Please do.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the more funding the IRS have, the more ability they would have to take on really difficult audits. And, you know, we know that the biggest tax gap, like the biggest gap between taxes owed and taxes paid are, you know, is pretty much at the top. The people who are the wealthiest corporations, like they're the ones taking advantage of like really complicated deductions and loopholes. And so I think inherently, the more funding you have, the more training you have to be able to take on those difficult audits, you're gonna, again, like pretty much automatically be able to target, you know, your sort of like wealthy white, the wealthy white elite. And it will help shift it, because right now, most of those audits are targeted for like low income and middle income folks. And so we just need to do what we can to flip that. And actually, I mean, I feel like that seems right on a moral level, but it also just makes sense in terms of revenue too. You know, the more we're able to do that, the more we're able to actually get more revenue and, you know, help actually fund the things that matter.
Absolutely. Oh. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so I was really thrilled to hear you talk about the Global Minimum Tax Standard Initiative. For me personally, I think this has been one of the most encouraging bits of like progress globally that we've seen in recent years. And so I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about it in terms of what is the sort of timeline, what are the steps that are needed in order to get it enacted? Would this mean, obviously it's trying to stop a race to the bottom amongst countries, but would that also stop a race to a bottom amongst states within the US as well? And most importantly, what can we do to try to help to make sure that this legislation passes?
Great question. I did not slip anything to the audience to have that asked. To step back a bit, what we had for 100 years or so was a situation in which all the countries got together and said, let's make it so that no corporation ever gets that same income tax twice across the globe. And what they did not do was to say what would happen if they managed to figure out ways to get it taxed no times anywhere. So companies figured out ways to park their profits in small island countries. Often these are high-income countries as well. I won't name names, but I could name Ireland. And that would reduce revenues in the countries that they were doing business. It would reduce revenues in the countries where the multinationals were headquartered. And ultimately for the tax havens, it wasn't a particularly good way to develop either, because as soon as they stopped providing tax haven, everyone would leave. So what happened was this global deal got together and said, well, the situation that we've had for 100 years, sometimes we've tried to fix it, and we've tried to fix it by punishing the small tax haven countries, and not the Irelands or the Luxembourgs, but the really small ones, the Caribbean ones, the ones where more brown people live, that we're trying to focus on this as a tool for economic development. We'll punish them, but we'll just continue letting the countries like the US or the UK or Germany, where these big multinationals are headquartered, we'll continue to let them do whatever they want to do, including let their multinationals get away with tax avoidance across the world. Fast forward 20 years of hearings, activation across the world to draw attention to the fact that multinationals are paying very little anywhere, and you get a deal that says corporations will have to pay at least 15% no matter where they are headquartered and where they're sort of doing business based on this deal. And the US was a really key player in securing that agreement, and what's happened now is that the US is going to be a laggard in terms of actually adopting the laws that subject its multinationals to that minimum tax standard. If that happens, other countries will simply tax US multinationals up to the 15% anyway. So it's just a pure loss of revenue for the states. It's just leaving things on the table. So what we really need to do is to set up to make sure that that implementation happens in 2025. And to your question about what we can do about it, is I think it is a little bit overlooked how big of a structural win this is. 15% gets talked about because that's the minimum, but that's the floor. We start at 15%, it means that every point that countries go above that, you know, the gap is smaller. So this is a structural thing that really could set us on the path to much more robust corporate taxation across the globe. And that's going to be really necessary if we want to sort of raise revenues in a progressive way that fund some of the priorities that we want to fund.
I could talk tax policy with this group all day, unfortunately. I'm getting the wrap-up sign. Oh, we have one more question? Okay. Yes, Catherine.
Thank you so much. This is just an amazing panel. Thank you. I wanted to hear in the last few seconds your top favorite policies, whether they're at the state level or the federal level, for eliminating racial disparities. What are the best levers?
Told you we were ungovernable. I'm going to take two. We should implement the corporate global tax deal, and we should plug this hole that allows huge incomes from accumulated wealth across generations to forever escape tax.
I'll say roll back the supermajority requirements in the states, because I think that opens all kind of doors.
Oh man, that's a good one. There's been this huge push back to flat taxes and eliminating income taxes altogether, but I think that having graduated income tax structures is one of the single best ways to approach that.
And I'll take moderator's privilege and point out that a disproportionate share of people who are excluded from the full child tax credit by the phase-in are Black or Latino, and so making that fully refundable would be a racial justice win as well. And with that, thank you guys so much. Give it up for our panel. Thank you to Groundwork, to Black Ops, everyone at Econ. Thank you.